Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos. Nosso convidado é Vijay Prashad, historiador e jornalista, nascido na Índia, é um dos mais renomados intelectuais marxistas da atualidade. Diretor executivo do Instituto Tricontinental, autor de 30 livros, é um estudioso da teoria do imperialismo e um militante da causa socialista. Antes de começar a entrevista, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes de nosso canal no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa de tua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência e nossa receita publicitária. Good morning, Mr. Prashad. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have your presence in our 20 minutes program.
Well, the honor is mine, firstly. Secondly, let me first immediately apologize for not speaking Portuguese. And I'm sorry that I speak the language of barbarians. But if you had spoken Hindi, we could have done this in Hindi.
Yes, but I do not.
Unfortunately, the bridge language between you and I is English. So there it is.
Yes. Mr. Prashad, what changes are possible in the imperialist system, in your opinion, with Joe Biden government?
So one of the key features of world events is that in the United States, there is a presidential election every 4 years. And so every 4 years, you go from one president and the other. So there's often an expectation that when the Republicans come, you'll have a kind of barbaric sort of presidency. You had that with George W. Bush, then you had that with Trump. And then there's an expectation that when a Democrat comes into the White House, they'll be sophisticated. They won't be barbarians. Well, Obama, Biden, and so on. The fact is that there is a kind of structural similarity between the Democrats and the Republicans when they're in the White House, particularly in terms of their relationship to the rest of the world. People forget that the pressure campaign on China, for instance, began with Obama, was deepened by Trump, and Biden is not retreating at all. Look, the pressure campaign against Venezuela, the horrible suffocation of Venezuela, begins with Obama, deepens with Trump, and is continuing with Biden. Is there going to be a significant change globally in terms of the structure of imperialism? Not at all. And people should not expect any change. What you will see is a different attitude, a different cultural way of behaving. Democrats are sophisticated, Breno. They are not barbarians in the way in which, say, Trump was a barbarian. Trump would come to a world meeting and push world leaders aside and come to the front to get his picture taken. We saw that, I think it was at the G7 meeting. He pushed aside another leader to come to the front. Now, Biden won't do that. He'll be more sophisticated and so on. When it comes down to much more polite, you're right. But when it comes down to policy, very much the same.
Many analysts say, due to the global crisis of capitalism aggravated by the pandemic, that a new structural change in the system would be underway with the abandonment of neoliberal paradigms. Do you agree with this point of view?
So the first thing is that it is true that in the European sector, in North America, there is a discussion, a serious discussion about changing the two elements of neoliberal policy making. One element is privatization, and the second element is austerity. These are the two interlinked dynamics of neoliberal policy making. it's true, Breno, that there is a sense that in at least Europe and in the United States, that there's going to be less of a religious attitude towards privatization and towards austerity. Governments are going to spend more. The debt ceilings are going to disappear. They're going to definitely spend more. And secondly, there is an appetite for more public sector spending, whether it's public sector healthcare, perhaps public sector infrastructure, and so on. So the neoliberal parameters inside Europe and the United States are going to be loosened. I think that's true. Even the Financial Times has editorialized, has said in its editorial pages that perhaps there should be a new consideration for wealth tax. Wealth tax. I even read in the Financial Times them saying that wealth should be taxed in such a way where you don't have to wait for a transaction tax. In other words, wealth is generally only taxed when you have inheritance, when you give your wealth to your children or to others. When you sit on your wealth, wealth is also taxed if you sell your assets, if you sell your shares. That's called capital gains taxes. But otherwise, if you just keep your wealth in a bank account, there's no taxation, and that leads to hoarding. So there has even been discussion in financial newspapers that wealth should be taxed. All of this is okay for Europe and the United States. When it comes to the rest of the world, there seems to be less of an appetite for opening up the space, the policy space out of neoliberalism. To give you an example, at a time when the world debt crisis continues to worry many countries, Zambia went into a bankruptcy situation late last year. At this time, the International Monetary Fund, led by a very capable person, has said publicly that debt servicing payments should not be an obligation. We should have a debt holiday. Countries should be allowed to spend on health to fight the pandemic and so on. And yet, the creditors, wealthy bondholders, the US Treasury Department and others refuse to allow for debt to be held off, to be put off till after the pandemic. Current total external debt of developing countries is about $11 trillion. And Breno, this is interesting. The debt servicing per year, annual debt service is $4 trillion on this 11 trillion. That's a lot of money just to pay off the debt. And instead of a holiday, governments are being forced to pay the debt. Once you force a country to pay the debt, Breno, then the neoliberal structure continues. It's not going to disappear. So what I'm just trying to say is, for Europe and the United States, they are loosening the strict neoliberal rules, but they're not loosening it for countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We saw in Argentina coming to the creditors saying, can we do an alternative to the very strict cuts that are being asked of the Argentinian budget, the government spending? The government of Alberto Fernandez went to the bondholders and they said, no, you have to go back home and you have to pass a neoliberal budget. That's it. Sorry, you got to do it. I don't see neoliberalism weakening when it comes to Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
But in terms of Europe and the United States, do you think that's possible to compare the Biden plan with the Roosevelt's New Deal?
It really depends on where that money is going to go. So it's a totally different era. So it's hard to compare them. In the era of Roosevelt, it seemed perfectly normal to have government institutions building things, government institutions providing services, and so on. This is before the era of privatization. That was before the era of public-private partnership. So when FDR, when Mr. Roosevelt in the 1930s began to increase government spending, a lot of the increase of government spending, Breno, was towards government programs, for government to go out there and build bridges, for governments to go out there and do relief work and so on. The government essentially paid its own employees to go and provide services directly. And in the case when a government does that, there are some restrictions on what people can make as salaries. There is no profit involved in going and building a bridge. The problem now is when Mr. Biden has an infrastructure bill You see, what you see, Breno, is at this point, the US government is not going to build those bridges by itself. It's not going to deliver services. They are going to contract the private sector. So the private sector is going to make a profit on these things, you see. So now the motivation is different. So it's actually not correct to talk about current government spending as a New Deal in the Roosevelt section. Roosevelt, they did things in order to enhance the public good. I think that's a very correct way to see things. Now you're going to continue, even with massive public spending, you're going to continue to see the private sector making profit out of government expenditure. It's not at all a New Deal. It's a New Deal for business, not a New Deal for society. You see, we want to see a New Deal for society, not a New Deal for business.
Do you think that Biden could do something like the Glass-Steagall reform, as a kind of the financial reform that Roosevelt led the United States?
So you're referring to a restriction placed on the banking industry, which prevented retail banks from using money that you and I, when we open a bank account, that's retail banking. This Glass-Steagall prevented banks from using our retail money to then go and invest it in the stock market or in places like that. The point being made by Glass-Steagall was, Breno, if you and I put our money in a bank, okay, I don't know how much savings you have, but my savings are miserable. I spend money on the wrong things. You can see books behind me, sometimes paintings, and I'll admit
that's also my addiction, as you can see behind
yes
me.
And my third thing is I drink too much. I'll admit that on your show. I don't tell people that much, and fortunately it's not something I'm not entirely embarrassed about. It's life. But
if it was a presidential interview, maybe we could do this interview drinking a good wine.
Exactly in person. That's what we'll do next.
Happily.
In São Paulo, when I meet you in São Paulo, we'll have a good drink and do an interview. Perfect.
Be my invite. I'm going to invite you to that.
Perfect. So, but when you and I put our money in a bank and the bank then invests it in the stock market, you and I don't benefit from that, because if the bank makes money, they don't hand us over part of the benefit of that. They make the money. So for that reason, Glass-Steagall said you can't misuse people's money, because if they lose the money, I never consented to have my money put into the stock market. You see, I didn't consent to that. I just put my money into your bank. The government then comes in and says, we guarantee your savings in the bank. But why should the government guarantee or insure my bank account if my bank account is being used by the bank to make money in the stock market? So Glass-Steagall prevented that. During the last years or last months of the administration of Bill Clinton, a Democrat, under some modest pressure from Wall Street and from Phil Gramm, who was then a leading Republican in the US Senate, they decided to push off Glass-Steagall to essentially, repeal it and to allow banks to use retail money in the stock market. This, of course, makes the financial casino of London, New York, Frankfurt, and so on get bigger, because more money is now available for them for their derivative markets and so on. From 1990s till the present, banks have enjoyed very much the lack of any restriction. So during the financial crisis, in the immediate aftermath of the credit crisis of 2007-2008, there was a promise for regulation, stricter regulation of banks. In Europe, there is an institution, the Basel system, where they have discussed and created various rules. There was Basel I, Basel II. They've come up with a whole infrastructure of rules. But Breno, if in the aftermath of the credit crisis of 2007-2008, they were unwilling to accept any kind of financial regulation, real financial regulation, point one. Point two, after the second round of financial wobbliness that happened about 5-6 years ago, before the coronavirus, 5-6 years ago, there was also some problems in the stock markets, because there was all kinds of anomalies taking place. Again, no regulation. It's important. if in these moments there was no regulation, I'm telling you, there will be no regulation now. And put it this way, in the aftermath of the credit crisis, particularly US banks were given liquidity by the US government. And at that time, the US government, neither did they take ownership of the banks, which they could have done, nor did they demand regulation. It's extraordinary. I, as a government, people's money, am liquefying a private institution, and I don't demand control of that institution. There's something wrong with the way power is distributed in the world, where a bank can take public support and not allow any public oversight. I just don't think, you'd have to be extraordinarily optimistic to say on a program, yes, of course, Mr. Biden is going to be able to tighten up bank regulations. No, the power doesn't reside there. I'll tell you, I watched a TV show recently, a British television show about, I don't know, terrorism or whatever. The Prime Minister of Britain is telling a journalist, and he says, you think I'm the Prime Minister of Britain, that I've reached the top of the mountain. You'd think that, in terms of power at least, you think that. But he said, sitting in this chair where the Prime Minister sits, I realized I haven't reached the top of the mountain. I'm somewhere in the middle. Mr. Biden, newsflash, you are not the most powerful man in the United States of America. You're somewhere in the middle.
Do you think that the new economic policy in the United States could bring benefits to the peoples of the capitalist periphery, such as those in Latin America?
So be careful, Latin America. Be very careful of what's coming. And we already have examples of what's coming. So smaller countries, Brazil is different because Brazil is a continental-sized country. It's a very large country. It has an enormous internal market. If tomorrow Brazil decided to, close down certain trade relations with around the world, well, you'd have a problem for your soy farmers. Yes, because they need to export. You can't absorb so much soy. But you have enough capacity for food production. You have enough capacity to generate employment internally without the need of any external things. You could do it. I mean, it's possible. Brazil is so large. India is so large. China is so large, and so on. Smaller countries, it's more complicated. So we've already seen examples in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and in El Salvador, where this particular thing I'm going to talk about has taken place. And it is a example of what's coming, Breno. And that's what I'm saying, be careful. So every country requires external financing. This is the nature of not only capitalism, but the nature of the modern world, bills come at the time when we may not have cash. The calendar is screwed up. Farmers have known this for centuries, that you may need to have financing when your crop is in the field. So you go to a financier and say, I'll pay you when I harvest my crop. You always need external financing. Some countries need more financing because they don't have access to money to finance infrastructure development, development of power grids and so on. Okay, fine. In an earlier time, Latin America used to go directly to the IMF, US government, and so on. That was the direct port of call. In the last 10 years, there's been an interest in Chinese funding. And so the Chinese state and private funding has entered into Ecuador during the time of Rafael Correa, entered into Bolivia at the time of Evo Morales, and has entered into El Salvador under 2 administrations. But what we've seen is interesting. The United States is using political power to prevent countries from getting any loans or any grants from China. So they have brought this contest between the US and China into financing for development in South America. And that's why I'm saying be careful. El Salvador signed a very good agreement with private and public Chinese money to develop a port on the Pacific side. It was to be a very important project for the Chinese, but also for El Salvador. Very important project. The president of El Salvador went to Beijing. On the way home, he stopped in Japan. At the time, the president was Shinzo Abe. Mr. Abe told him that you should break your ties with China and sign a deal with the United States. Now, why this is an interesting story, that's exactly what El Salvador did, by the way. Why this is an interesting story is that the Chinese never told any of these countries not to take money from the US or to trade with the US. Look at Brazil. Brazil's president's son is extremely racist on social media against the Chinese. And yet China continues to want to have trade relations with Brazil. It doesn't use trade politically. It says, here's trade and then here's politics. The United States has a history of using trade and politics together, like making trade a political issue. If you don't do this, we'll sanction you, for instance, that kind of talk. So when we say, what's the relationship for Latin America and so on, in terms particularly of financing, I would say that, look, Latin American countries need to have a discussion amongst themselves about what should be the attitude towards this Cold War taking place between the United States and China, and how they should develop an independent foreign policy. It's quite, I'm going to say this, on Saturday, the No Cold War platform is holding an event about the No Cold War in Brazil, the Cold War between the US and China. We've got, people like Celso Amorim, Dilma Rousseff, Wang Wen, and others will be speaking on the platform on Saturday morning. I think it's a very important discussion. But this needs to be a deeper discussion. Brazil used to have, and I say used to, Breno, I mean it. There was a time, I remember, when I was covering the United Nations as a reporter, and every time I met Brazilian diplomats, I used to be so impressed by them. They were some of the highest quality diplomats in the world. Brazil, Egypt had very sophisticated diplomats and so on. Brazil had an independent foreign policy even during the time of the dictatorship. It had an independent foreign policy. Now it appears to be subordinated to the United States. And you have to wonder, is that worth it for the Brazilian people? Like, if Brazil during the dictatorship had an independent foreign policy, and now you're not in a dictatorship, shouldn't you have no, it seems to be subordinated. It's something for the people of Brazil to consider, seriously consider.
30 years after the Soviet collapse, do you think that the socialist perspective has had a chance in the world again? Would the strengthening of China have this meaning?
It's not just China, because Breno, look, the pandemic was first discovered as human-to-human transmission on the 20th of January, 2020. Vietnam and Laos are tiny little socialist countries, both very poor, both have a border with China. Neither of them had a catastrophic pandemic, because right when the news came that there is a pandemic, they immediately told their public, wear masks, wash your hands, physical distance, hand sanitizer, and so on. Secondly, they immediately got their public health system working. Trained people went out there, did contact testing, etc. Vietnam and Laos show us, Breno, that you don't need money to fight a pandemic. What you need is a socialistic perspective that puts people before profit. That's what you need. They didn't do mass scale lockdowns. They did targeted, rational lockdowns where there was an infectious outbreak. They tested people, they isolated them, they treated them, and so on. They didn't go crazy, on the one side saying there's no pandemic. I mean, look at Bolsonaro's behavior. No pandemic, made light of it, wore no mask, didn't say anything, pretended that nothing was happening. Up there in Amazonia, people said, look, we need to have water to wash our hands. And the government made light of that. Oh, you don't need water and so on. That's why the health professionals in Brazil have taken Bolsonaro to the International Criminal Court, charged him with genocidal crimes against humanity and so on. Compare what's happened to Brazil, to India, horrible situation. Compare that to Vietnam. I'm not saying compared to China. China is, it's an industrial country. It's a relatively well-off country and so on. And they have been able to break the back of this virus. But compared to Vietnam, compared to Cuba, 11 million people on an island, my God, 29,000 medical students, Breno, went door to door and tested everybody. Wherever you live in Sao Paulo, I doubt very much that a government person came and tested you in your home. I don't think SUS did that. I don't think Bolsonaro directed medical students, go and test everybody. It just doesn't happen in a capitalist society. Now, it's not for me to say that socialism is better than capitalism. Who cares what I think? Look at the reality of it. Look today in the state of Kerala in India, 35 million people. The government, it's a communist government, operated at a level where they took care of everybody. And in this communist state in Kerala, in India, the government has pledged free broadband for everybody, free internet. Why? If we're going to have lockdowns, how are children going to study if they don't have free internet? Internet must be a free right in your house if you're going to lock the city down. You can't tell people, now you are locked down, now pay a private company for internet. That's crazy. You are telling me I have to be stuck in my house. You're telling my children go to a school run by the government where I don't pay any fees. But now you're telling me to have my children do schooling from the home and I have to pay internet. That means the school is no more free. That means education systems are no more free. So for that reason, people are outraged in the world. And I'm saying to you, let's decide. Don't ask me. It shouldn't be a question for me. Do I think socialism has a future? It's a question I want to ask other people. Do you want to live in these wretched societies where your government has absolutely no humanity towards you? Whether leaders whether it's Modi in India or it's, Bolsonaro in Brazil or whatever, these kind of leaders, do you prefer this or do you prefer like a society where Cuban doctors are going around the world, great risk to their own life, treating people and so on? I mean, what kind of society? Just think about it. Where are the Brazilian doctors who are going abroad to treat people? There are barely enough Brazilian doctors to treat Brazilians. In fact, Brazil is now ruining the day. It's regretting that Bolsonaro told the Cuban doctors to go home. It's regretting the day. You want those Cuban doctors back. Let me ask you a question. Cuba, what is the population of Sao Paulo now?
20 million.
20 million, right? What is the population of
the great Sao Paulo? 20 million.
20 million. What's the population of Cuba today?
11 million.
11 million. That means
Belgium.
Sao Paulo is basically almost twice the size of Cuba.
Yes.
How many doctors from Sao Paulo have twice the number of doctors from Sao Paulo should have been working in Belize, in Jamaica, in Suriname, there are no Sao Paulo doctors. Forget Brazilian doctors. That's the heroic nature of Cuba.
Doctors enough to Sao Paulo.
Exactly. That is why it's not for me to say whether socialism has a future. It's for the residents of Sao Paulo to say, do you prefer to live in Sao Paulo right now or to live in Cuba?
Is capitalism dying or someone is going to have to kill it?
No social system, as it were, just dies on its own, particularly a system where the power is so entrenched in a minority of the population. The power is entrenched. That section will not allow the collapse of their system, the decimation, and they are not going to surrender this, themselves willingly say, look, we don't want to run things. I mean, right now, illicit tax havens, whether it's in Dubai or Liechtenstein or Panama, we did a calculation. We found that illicit tax havens has about $37 trillion sitting in it. $37 trillion in illicit tax havens. That's a lot of money, friends. That's more than three times the external debt of developing countries. $37 trillion. So, I mean, that's a good indicator that capitalism won't fall by itself. Because the class that dominates in societies like Brazil, India, the United States, the big capitalist blocks, the class that dominates here, not only do they not have the feeling for their own population, but they are hiding their personal wealth overseas. They are not patriotic people. You see, they don't have an ounce of patriotism in them. When you say, well, will the system sort of surrender by itself? No, not if the people in charge they don't have any humanity toward their own fellow citizens. Why would they give up their power? I mean, we talk about patriotism. If I had a chance to ask Mr. Bolsonaro, and ask him, Mr. President Bolsonaro, you talk a lot about patriotism and Brazil and how great and so on. If you were genuinely so patriotic, have you ever, had an inquiry of how much Brazilian elite money is sitting outside Brazil, like in European banks or in illicit tax havens? Why don't you open an inquiry and you say that, look, Brazil is a great patriotic country, then all Brazilians should keep their savings in Brazilian banks in Brazil? Why don't you open an inquiry? I'll be interesting to hear, Breno, what he says.
Mr. Prashad, the great revolts and revolutions of the 20th century took place on the periphery of the capitalist system, in the most backward countries in Europe, beside nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Do you think this will continue to be the trend in the 21st century? Could similar phenomena occur in the central capitalist states, or do revolutionary chances continue to focus on the poorest countries?
Well, you're asking a question that's 100 years old.
Yes, it is.
You could have asked me this question.
But this is a million question.
Yes, but this question could have been asked in 1918, right after the revolution in the Tsarist Empire, the October Revolution. What was everybody waiting for? All the revolutions, they were all waiting for Germany. When is the German Revolution going to happen? In fact, there was a premature attempt during which Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were killed by the government of Friedrich Ebert. So that didn't happen. There was no revolution in England, none in France, none in the United States, none in Canada, and so on and so forth. Actually, Lenin had predicted a lot of this. And I'm going back to 100 years, Breno, because this argument actually still continues, which is that he said that, look, the imperialist core countries like the United States, Britain, etc., France, there are certain advantages they get out of the imperialist system. For instance, in a country like India, wages are suppressed for the vast mass of the people. So their life conditions are lowered. They have very little chance of improving their status. They don't eat much and so on. Hunger rates are high. There's artificial suppression of wages, and so massive super profits are made through their work. You don't see an evening out of the wages of a worker in the United States and the wages of a worker in Mexico. This is a border, right? The US-Mexico border. One side there's an automobile factory, car factory. Another side there's a car factory. The wages here for an automaker, a worker in a car factory, much higher in the US than in Mexico.
Maybe three times.
Why don't they even out? And the border plays a role here. That's the nature of, one of the natures of imperialism is that border, is the prevention of free movement of labor. That's a huge thing. If labor could move, then you might even out wage levels. If more people came up, you might see a deterioration and so forth. So that doesn't happen. And because of that, because of this unevenness, there are certain advantages that labor has in the north, or it can be bought off. At least a section of labor can be bought off. Lenin called that the labor aristocracy. In fact, you see that in the United States now, that's called the middle class. People say, I'm not a worker, I'm the middle class, even though they have essentially waged labor jobs. Their consciousness is now related to the financiers and the people in power. Their consciousness goes in that direction. You see that in countries like India and Brazil as well. The middle class will grow, but the middle class is essentially the upper section of the working class that moves into white collar, sometimes not even white collar jobs. But their consciousness goes more toward the bosses than toward the rest of society. And because of that, revolutionary change in countries that are highly advanced doesn't seem to be on the cards easily. You're not going to see a revolutionary development in the United States. Now, I'm going to say that to you today, Breno. Today, the date is whatever, the 11th of May, 2021, and suddenly in September 2021 there'll be a revolution in the US, and then you can laugh at me, you can phone me up and say, what a stupid thing you said. I'm taking a gamble, but I think it's a good gamble. I doubt that there'll be a revolutionary change there. One reason there's revolutionary change was possible in the poorer countries was the states were less tentacular. The states were less, in everybody's, they were less sophisticated in their power mechanisms. It was easier to do a kind of putsch. Take the case of Cuba in 1959. It's hard to reproduce Cuba today in an advanced industrial country. The state is too powerful. It has military capacity, yes, but it also has ideological capacity. It has the capacity to conduct information war against you, and so on and so forth, which is why most revolutions today, rather revolutionary projects, come through the ballot box and not through these kind of changes. We see in South America this wave of revolutionary changes that begins perhaps with the election in Venezuela in 1998, when Hugo Chavez wins the first election. That pink tide, or that wave, was a wave of ballot box victories, very different from an earlier era where you had a revolutionary putsch, where you come in and the people with mass mobilization seize control of the state. This new wave is all ballot box. Which among these was street level putsch? None. In Bolivia, for instance, you had the mass demonstrations in Cochabamba, the gas wars, the water wars, and so on. Those delegitimized the government that had been there at the time. But Morales wins in the ballot box. He doesn't win in the thing. In the advanced industrial countries, the socialists have a very hard time advancing in the electoral domain. Look at what they did to Bernie Sanders in the United States. They just sabotaged his ability to come to the head of the Democratic ticket. Look what they did to Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. They sabotaged his ability to win by accusing him of anti-Semitism, expelling him from the Labour Party, and so on. So I just don't think that if the current revolutionary dynamic in most modern industrial society is going to be through the ballot box, we have to utilize that mechanism. If we agree, Breno, that that's the vehicle in our times, and I don't see an alternative right now. I don't see armed struggle in our time as being able to deliver the results. Even in Colombia, we see the FARC come above ground now, and they're going to attempt once more a ballot box challenge to the oligarchy, to Ivan Duque, and so on. So if that is the case, the sophisticated way in the West in particular that socialism has been put off the ballot, you're not allowed to vote for socialism. If that's the case, I just don't see a revolutionary turn in my lifetime in the advanced industrial countries. But I do think that in Asia, Africa, Latin America, we have a good chance of electing a great number of socialist projects. We might see that this year, later in the year in Zambia, when Fred Madembe and the Socialist Party of Zambia are going to put up a stiff challenge to the right-wing government of Edgar Lugo. So we'll see this in different elections. I'm hoping Daniel Jadwe in Chile will be able to, prevail as the candidate of the left against the candidate of the right. Again, 5-6 candidates. If Pedro Castillo is able to have the people unite behind him, he defeats Madame Fujimori in Peru. One more election. So that's what I'm trying to say is, in our times, the ballot box is the struggle for this moment. The left has to utilize that.
How do you analyze the growth of neo-fascist extreme right currents in the 21st century, capable of reaching the government in countries as important as the United States, India, and Brazil?
Well, if I tell you the India story, it actually is the same elsewhere. And maybe that's the best way to go. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Congress Party, which had been the party of, the freedom struggle against British rule, that party had already become a center-right, kind of capitalist party. Now, in an earlier period, the Congress Party was able to build mass support because it delivered social welfare projects, they protected agriculture, and so on. They had this very great depth of support because they provided agricultural support to farmers and to agricultural workers, credit, cheap credit and so on. When they withdrew all this in the period of globalization after the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Congress's main force of legitimacy began to disappear. We see this in the United States when the Democratic Party also abandons labor unions, abandons the social movements, and becomes the party of business. So you have this happening on the one side. The left is weakened by globalization pressures, trade union density decreases and so on. And the door is open for the right wing, because the right wing emerged in India on two flanks. One is it emerged using hard nationalist language, saying, we are going to protect you against all this that the Congress has done. You see, we're going to protect you. We are going to get you jobs. I use a phrase. I edited a book called Strong Men, which was about Modi, about Trump, about Duterte, about Erdogan, and so on. And in that book, I wrote this neo-fascist emerges. This is clear in Bolsonaro also, and they say that they will take the economy by the neck, Breno. They will hold the economy by the neck. They'll squeeze it so tightly it will cough up jobs. That's their promise. But they don't have any economic plan. Their economic plan is the same as the one of the people that they have supplanted, of the center-right. They have center-right economics and neo-fascistic language about minorities. They try to create a electoral bloc out of people who are dissatisfied with their lives by saying the reason you have problem in your life is got nothing to do with economics. It has everything to do with homosexuals or ethnic minorities or immigrants or feminists and communists. And I mean, it's a hallucination. But it's a powerful hallucination. And particularly because they say, we understand the problem in your life. See, what's the thing with the center-right is it no longer spoke with compassion. These people speak with a kind of narrow compassion. I feel for you. Nobody else talks about you, you ordinary Brazilian. I feel for you. And that's compelling. But then they turn around and say, and the reason your problems are there is because look at this migrant, or look at the Venezuelans, or look at this. I mean, it's a easy way to come to power, Breno, but it's a hard way to govern. It's a hard way to govern because you don't have any, way to solve the problems of the people whose lives you said I claim to understand. You say, I understand your life, you lower middle class Brazilian, but then you don't do anything for them. So you can't sustain this rule unless and until you deepen their hatred of minorities. And you make it all about the social issues. You say, I'm going to protect you from pornography and abortion. And then people say, I don't care that I don't eat, but at least I don't have pornography and abortion.
Is it useful, this neo-fascism is useful to the ruling classes and the liberal economical agenda?
One problem for the ruling class and the liberal economic agenda is they don't actually have a really good, they don't have a very good way to reach the masses. You see, you can't go to the masses, Breno. You can't go and say, listen, masses, please vote for us. We are going to cut your public education. We're going to cut your wages. You won't get good health care. What kind of agenda is this? You can't go to the people with this agenda and say, sorry, we're going to cut the taxes of the rich and also cut services to you. Your grandmother who used to get visited by a government nurse, no more. Now you have to drive 3 hours to go and make sure your grandmother is eating and so on, because we call that privatization. Nobody's going to vote for you like that, Breno. Come on, they don't have a way to. So instead, you get this neo-fascist who come and says, listen, vote for us because we're going to protect your grandmother from that immigrant that comes from Bolivia. We're going to protect your grandmother. And so you make it fear-mongering. People vote for them, but then they'll cut the nurse going to see your grandmother and they'll do all that. But they'll keep saying to you, but we're protecting your grandmother from that, fantasy Bolivian who's going to hurt. This is what's useful to the oligarchy, as it were. It is useful to them. Somebody like Bolsonaro is a useful figure for the more sophisticated Sao Paulo bourgeoisie that likes to eat, whatever it is, they like to drink the finest wines and discuss art, and they like to listen to opera, whatever they like to do. Sophisticated people, they themselves are not against homosexuality. They themselves are not against this, that, and the other thing. But they're quite happy to have this fellow go out there and say these things and have, young gay kids get killed on the street because this hatred is intensified. They are quite happy to have this guy say all this stuff, and then the police goes into a favela and shoots 32 people in cold blood. They are outraged by that. You see, in sitting in their salons in their fine neighborhoods, they are outraged that there is anti-gay, killings are happening. We feel terrible about that, but they're quite happy for Bolsonaro to do their dirty work. Okay. Bolsonaro is like not just Modi as well. Modi is like the hatchet man, the guy you send out there to do the dirty work you don't want to. Bourgeoisie doesn't like getting its hands dipped in blood. Doesn't like that. In Germany in the 1930s, the high bourgeoisie, the von this and the von that, they didn't want their own fingers in the blood. So they sent this Austrian painter and said, you go do it for us. It's the same kind of thing. Who is the Austrian painter today? Who is the Austrian painter today?
Of course. Mr. Prashad, 10 years after the so-called Arab revolt, with the overthrow of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, what's your assessment of these episodes? Well, each country is different. There is really no such thing as the Arab Spring. It's not one thing. It was, of course, people took inspiration for each other, but in each context, the revolt was different and so on. Of course, you salute the people of Tunisia who had a very successful moment. They overthrew a government and they've created some sort of democratic project that's good. Although I must say that the current Tunisian government has been targeting activists and so on. It's miserable. For the left, it's been difficult in Tunisia, but nonetheless, a process is open, from before. My person I knew a little bit, Chokri Belayat, was assassinated right after the overthrow of the government of Ben Ali. He was a poet. He was a trade union leader. He was a leader of a left-wing political party. Of course, ugly things happened and so on. Every country is different. The situation in, say, Libya, it was miserable. I mean, the way it turned out. I mean, NATO and the United States used both Libya and Syria in a way to settle their old scores. Under the cover of the Arab Spring, they insinuated themselves, settled their own scores and so on. So it's a mixed bag. Where are we now 10 years later? It's not good. Egypt is perhaps back in the period of imprisonment of anybody with an independent opinion. It's very much a shameful situation in a country like Egypt, a great country with a terrific history, a history that produced Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Free Officers Movement in 1952, and they got rid of the monarchy. They fought off imperialism and so on. Now they have become an adjutant state of imperialism. They do the dirty work of the United States and have done so for a long period of time. It's very complicated, Breno. I don't want to make some sort of categorical statement because it is a country by country situation. But at the heart of it, the real problem in the region is two sets of deep cold wars that are happening in the region. Both of them actually have Saudi Arabia in the middle of it. One of the cold wars is a cold war within Sunni Islam between or the countries of Sunni Islam between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, whose main states are Qatar and Turkey, are in a direct clash with Saudi Arabia. And a lot of the destabilization in Libya is because of this clash between the Muslim Brotherhood, mainly supported by Turkey and Qatar, and that's the government in Tripoli, and the government that's out in the east, in Tobruk and in Benghazi. That government is supported by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And so that's one major cold war is between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis. The second big war is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You see, until these two sets of conflicts are dialed down, until the Middle East is going to be in a problem. I mean, because
There's a Syrian poet that I like who said that, your enemies don't come through the front door. Your enemies come like ants. They find a crack at the bottom of the door and they march right in. You see, imperialism doesn't need to come like it came in Iraq, where it comes with the planes and bombs a country. If you are weak, if you have holes in your door frame, the ants will enter. So you've got to take care of your own neighborhood. If the Arabs fight amongst themselves with the Turks and the Iranians, imperialism will insinuate itself. Look at Palestine right now, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Gaza. Israelis do whatever they want because they know the Arabs are disorganized. Nobody is going to confront them. So they do what they want. They treat the Palestinians as an encaged population.
Do you think the United States will continue to have Israel as its main ally in the Middle East? Is a two-state solution to the Palestinian question still possible?
Well, let's start with the easiest answer there. The two-state solution died a long time ago. I mean, I've been to Palestine several times, and when you're in the West Bank, you will see that there is no West Bank. There are Israeli settlements all over the place. They've eaten the land up. East Jerusalem, which was part of supposed to be the settlement, the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where these fights are happening now, the Israelis have been trying to illegally evict Palestinians from a court case in 1972, illegally trying to evict the Palestinians since 1972. Why is it illegal? Because in 1967, when Israel seized East Jerusalem, UN Security Council Resolution 242 makes it very clear that no territorial changes can be made. That's part of, it's a war crime to seize a place in war and then change the facts on the ground. And yet, since 1972, in a court case in Israel, Israeli Zionist settlers have been trying to evict the 3,000 families, 3,000 people from Sheikh Jarrah. I've been to Sheikh Jarrah, walked through it. It's not a large area. Nonetheless, it's a principle. And so the two-state solution died a long time ago. Israel will not accept a one-state solution because it prefers to be a Jewish state. If it accepts Palestinians into it, they say that the character of the Jewish state will go, but that's an apartheid condition. That's an apartheid state. That's why even Human Rights Watch said that Israel is an apartheid state. That's an easy answer. The harder one is the United States and Israel as its main ally. In fact, Breno, I would say that United States has several main allies in the Arab region, in West Asia. One of them is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is as much an ally as Israel. These are the two main allies. But I feel that, yes, the United States will not, quote unquote, as they say, quote unquote, abandon Israel. It will not, for many, many, many reasons. But one of them is that there is significant section of the US voting public that has a strong desire for the US to back Israel. And I don't mean Jewish population in the US. I don't at all mean the Jewish population. The reason is the Jewish population is split over the question of what should be the situation with Israel. I mean the evangelical Christians, because the evangelical Christians have this bizarre idea that the Jews must now build the sacred temple again, and then God will kill all the Jews and the Christians will ascend to heaven. It's a crazy idea. It's anti-Semitic to the core, because this idea is genocidal. It says that when God, after the Jews create the temple, they'll all be killed. I mean, why would the state of Israel ally with these nutcases? And I gather, Breno, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that this opinion is gathering steam in Brazil through Pentecostalism and so on. This idea of like this, the second building of the temple, and it's a crazy idea. It's actually anti-Semitic. It's actually a genocidal, anti-Semitic, crazy idea. But for that reason, people will just not break ties with Israel.
You have published articles about the German Democratic Republic. I stated that existed only between 1949 and 1990. What's your assessment of the socialist experience in the 20th century Europe based on this specific case?
So you're exactly right. The German Democratic Republic lasted for about 41 years. I checked this, Breno, because I was interested. I checked the average life expectancy of a German male. The average life expectancy of a German male is twice that of the life of the German Democratic Republic. That means the GDR died prematurely. It died after 40 years. I'm 54 years old. I myself am older than the German Democratic Republic when it expired. So we don't seem to appreciate that it barely lasted a generation. Very short time of life. And yet in that short time, it did some amazing things. Now, what's fascinating is that after the fall of the GDR, after its absorption by West Germany, the new German government took extraordinary measures to suppress the history of East Germany. Extraordinary measures. They made certain things illegal. You couldn't, for instance, talk about the fact that in East Germany, there was no homelessness. Now, I don't want to suggest at all that East Germany was a paradise. There was too much state security. There was too many errors in terms of delivery of consumption goods, blah, blah, blah. There's a long list, okay? But at the same time, let's see what they did right. Why can't we even look at that? And that's banned in Germany. You see, what do they have to hide? Why? I thought they were for free speech and against authoritarian. And yet they ban an inquiry, sensible inquiry into that. That's interesting. Because to basically delegitimize socialism, they tried to unite socialism and Nazism, make it one thing. It's a total opposite, because guess what we learned? We learned that after the fall of the Nazi regime, basically beaten by the Red Army, the Soviet army, after the fall of that Nazi regime, in East Germany, they totally denazified the population. They fired all the Nazis from educational institutions, from the courts and everything, right? Which is why immediately afterwards they had a very hard time. They couldn't attract teachers, not because the teachers went to West Germany. It's because when they fired the Nazis went to West Germany. In West Germany, not only did the Nazis remain in their teaching and in their jobs as judges and so on, but the CIA worked with the new West German government to develop a West German intelligence service which was run by a notorious Nazi. The Nazis were welcomed into the structure of the West German state, and in fact, they became a key part of it. So now let's think about who cosseted, who collaborated with the disgusting Nazi regime. Nazi regime was a disgusting, racist, genocidal regime. The East Germans cleaned them all out. The West Germans made them into, now respectable people. All of this history is forgotten. I'm very keen on reviving it. Not because I want to have a debate about history, but I want to have a debate about the character of the bourgeois order and the character of the socialist order. It seems to me the bourgeois order is quite happy to collaborate with Nazis, and South America knows a lot about this, because let's not forget the butcher of what was it, Leon, comes and heads the creation of a terrible state security service in Bolivia. And I'm talking about Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie comes and helps the dictatorship in Bolivia create a state security apparatus. And the group that overthrew Evo Morales, that little fascist group led by, thank God I've forgotten his name, Breno. I don't want you to even say his name. Don't say his name. Don't say it, Breno. Forget him. He's a twerp, right? No, you're right. It's Camacho. But the group he runs, they take the inspiration from the heritage of Klaus Barbie. This is the character of these people. We go from West Germany to Bolivia, and we see what West Germany collaborated with the Nazis in the 1950s. We see Bolivia now, the right wing, essentially absorbing Nazi ideology and the history of Nazism, even in the way they say hello to each other, the way they greet each other, the same sort of insignia and so on. So it's not a historical discussion about, the past. It's not. See, I'm making a direct line between these 40 years of East Germany and West Germany and the current events in Bolivia. It's not yesterday's news. It's right there with us today.
Mr. Prashad, we are ending this incredible interview, and I would like to ask two questions about pandemia. First of these questions, what did you read or are reading during the pandemic, and would like to suggest to our internet users?
Well, because I'm like that. The first book is I'm the chief editor of a publishing house in New Delhi, and so I read this book, which we published, called People's Planning by Thomas Isaac, who was the former finance minister of Kerala, and Richard Frank, and it's about how the communist government of Kerala conducted people's planning. It's a little bit like what you did in Porto Alegre, but it's deeper than that. And the story is very interesting. And we published it this year, but I had to read the manuscript during the pandemic. So that's one.
Kerala is ruled by the Communist Party Marxist.
Yes, correct. The party to which I also belong. So that's one. Secondly, I'm now reading a book by Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik called Capital and Imperialism, which, if you were to ask me, I think is the best book I've read on the question of imperialism in years. They are senior Marxists who taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. They are incredible. And this is I highly recommend it. And I hope very much Espresso Popular will publish this in Portuguese.
And which movies or series you'd like to indicate?
Well, I am too embarrassed to tell you what series I watch, so I shall not tell you what series I watch, but I will tell you that I decided at the beginning of the pandemic to go back and watch two Japanese directors whose work I love. One of them is the early films of Akira Kurosawa, the early films, and you know, if I was to suggest one of his early films, I would suggest No Regrets for Our Youth, which is about communism in Japan. It's beautiful. This is before Kurosawa made his samurai movies. And the other director who I adore, and he was a conservative director, is Yasujiro Ozu, and it's his late films, and in particular Late Autumn. So I decided to treat myself, Breno, and I watched all these movies again, all of them.
Mr. Prashad, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for giving us this incredible interview. Thank you very much.
Anytime, and next time in São Paulo.
Of course. Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos.
Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos, deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal, você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.